It was the summer of 2002 when the small town of Ashford, Texas experienced a loss that would forever change its tight-knit community. Lena Drake, a 24-year-old university graduate, disappeared without a trace. A young woman known for her warm smile and fierce ambition, Lena had big plans for the future. On the fateful evening she vanished, Lena was supposed to meet friends for dinner but never arrived. No one heard from her again. The search for Lena became urgent, but as hours turned into days, the community grew fearful of what could have happened. The case, once filled with hope, quickly turned into a mystery that seemed unsolvable. Her disappearance was all anyone could talk about, but the investigation into the case faced one dead end after another. What happened to Lena Drake? Would the people of Ashford ever get an answer? As the clock ticked on, local law enforcement, led by Detective Nathaniel Hayes, launched a full-scale investigation. They combed the surrounding woods, searched Lena's apartment, and questioned anyone who might have seen her the night of her disappearance. But no substantial clues emerged. The only thing they found was a broken cell phone, discarded in a small alley, but it led to nowhere. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no ransom note. It was as if Lena had vanished into thin air. Her family, devastated and desperate for answers, pleaded with anyone who might have seen something to come forward. But all they received were rumors and unsubstantiated tips. Even though there was an air of suspicion around certain individuals in Ashford, none could be linked to the case. The people of Ashford began to fear that Lena was just another name on a long list of unsolved disappearances, her case quickly being lost in the sea of cold files. Her parents, Amelia and Thomas Drake, were beside themselves with grief. They couldn't understand how their daughter could just disappear. Amelia spent sleepless nights clutching Lena's childhood photos, while Thomas reached out to any private investigator who might help. Yet all efforts seemed in vain. The case quickly went cold, and the fear of losing their daughter forever began to settle in their hearts. By the end of 2002, the investigation had lost momentum. The local police department, stretched thin with other cases, had little resources to devote to Lena's disappearance. Detective Hayes, still haunted by the case, handed it off to the cold case unit, where it sat, gathering dust. But in Ashford, Lena's family never gave up hope. They continued to push for updates and kept her story alive in the media. Each year, as the anniversary of her disappearance came and went, the community paused to remember Lena Drake, the bright young woman who had been taken without a trace. Years passed and the case became an afterthought for many. New families moved into Ashford, and the people who had once been so connected by the tragedy began to drift apart. But for Sylvia White, the town's local journalist, Lena's story never left her mind. Sylvia had covered the case in the early days, and as the years went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they were missing, something vital. For the community, the silence became a painful reminder of the unresolved loss. As time moved on, the residents of Ashford tried to move on as well. Lena was no longer the girl they saw at the diner or the woman they heard laughing with her friends. She was just a name, a faded face on a missing persons flyer. Yet deep down they all knew, something had to give. Lena Drake's disappearance left more than a void in the Drake family, it left a palpable sadness in the town of Ashford. The town, usually bustling with friendly chatter and the hum of daily life, now seemed haunted by the mystery of what had happened to one of their own. Local businesses posted missing person flyers. The school's annual event in Lena's memory continued every year, with a moment of silence dedicated to her. Yet, despite all the memorials and tributes, no one had answers. Her parents, Amelia and Thomas, had never fully recovered. Amelia had become a shadow of her former self, unable to find peace. She spent her nights volunteering for missing persons organizations, searching for some way to make sense of the unbearable grief. Thomas, once a strong and determined man, seemed to retreat into his work, becoming distant and silent at family gatherings. The pain of not knowing, of not being able to mourn properly because there was no closure, was unbearable. For the rest of Ashford, the sense of security that had once defined their town was gone. Neighbors began to lock their doors at night. Children were no longer allowed to play outside after dark. The friendly smiles and open doors of the past had been replaced with guarded looks and hushed conversations. Ashford had become a town shaped by fear, a town that no longer felt like home. Days turned into weeks as the small town of Ashford held its breath. Lena's disappearance had sparked an urgency among the townsfolk, but it was the investigators who bore the heavy burden of finding answers. Detective Nathaniel Hayes, who had been leading the case since the start, quickly realized that this was no ordinary missing person case. With every passing day, the chances of finding Lena alive grew slimmer. But still, he pressed on, believing that somewhere, there had to be a clue, a break in the case that would point them in the right direction. The first few days were frantic. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, and search teams scoured the town, knocking on doors, asking questions, and looking for any sign of Lena. Her apartment was searched thoroughly, and even her social media accounts were combed for any sign of suspicious activity. Yet nothing turned up. There were no signs of a struggle at her home, and the friends she had planned to meet for dinner the night she disappeared were equally baffled. They had seen no signs that anything was wrong. As weeks went by, Lena's family was left to grapple with the painful reality that there might be no answers. Her parents, Amelia and Thomas Drake, were shattered. They would return to their daughter's apartment every day, desperately searching for any small detail that might offer a clue. But all they found were the empty spaces she had left behind: a forgotten coffee cup, a half-finished book, and a world that would never be the same without her. Despite their grief, Amelia and Thomas never gave up hope. They joined every search effort, pleading with anyone who would listen. Their grief turned into a quiet but relentless determination, a desire to find the truth that would bring some kind of closure. Yet, as the months wore on, the investigation ground to a halt. With no clear suspects and no solid leads, the case slowly faded from the public eye. Detective Hayes struggled with the lack of progress. For someone used to solving cases, this one was different, elusive, haunting. Every step forward seemed to lead them 2 steps back. They looked into Lena's relationships, both personal and professional, but found nothing suspicious. No enemies, no odd behavior. Just a bright young woman with a promising future, now lost to an unknown fate. The case grew colder, and as the months turned to years, it became just another forgotten name in the cold case files. But even as the case seemed to slip into obscurity, there was one thing Detective Hayes couldn't shake: the nagging feeling that they were missing something. Something crucial. A small detail perhaps, overlooked in the rush to solve the case. And so, even as the case was officially closed and added to the pile of unsolved mysteries, Hayes refused to let go. It wasn't just his job, it was his responsibility to find the truth, no matter how long it took. Years passed, and the investigation remained stagnant, yet something in the air of Ashford had begun to shift. It wasn't obvious, but a quiet undercurrent of anticipation seemed to grip the town. It was as though the people were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the truth to come to light. And then, in the most unexpected way, it did. A break in the case came not from a tip or a witness, but from an overlooked piece of evidence. The discovery was completely accidental, buried under decades of dust. A small storage locker in a police evidence room, once used during the initial investigation, was finally revisited as part of a routine review of cold cases. Inside that locker, buried beneath a stack of unrelated files, was an old piece of surveillance footage, a clip that had been recorded the night before Lena's disappearance. It was nothing more than a random, blurry shot from a nearby gas station, but as Detective Hayes reviewed it for the first time in years, he noticed something odd. At first it was subtle. A shadow moving across the screen, a brief glimpse of a figure entering the frame. The image was grainy and the angle was poor, but there was something unmistakably familiar about it. Hayes paused the footage. His heart raced as he zoomed in on the figure in the background. It was a man walking hurriedly towards the station's exit, with a posture that seemed too rigid, too determined. The way he moved, it was unsettling. And most importantly, he appeared to be following Lena. The footage, previously dismissed as useless, had just revealed the first concrete lead in years. Detective Hayes immediately ordered a deeper analysis of the footage. They enhanced the image and compared it to known criminal databases. The man was unfamiliar to local authorities, but after running his image through multiple systems, a hit finally came back. The figure on the screen was Kyle Avery, a man with a criminal record that included theft and assault. He was a former resident of Ashford who had left town years earlier, but the connection was clear. Kyle had been near the scene the night Lena disappeared. This breakthrough, though shocking, was just the beginning. With Kyle Avery identified, the investigation began anew, and the townspeople were once again filled with a glimmer of hope. The long years of silence had been shattered by a single forgotten piece of evidence, one that had been overlooked by so many, but which now seemed to hold the key to unraveling the mystery. But there were questions that lingered. Why had Kyle Avery been following Lena? Was he involved in her disappearance, or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was this truly the break they had all been waiting for, or would it raise even more chilling questions? With the renewed investigation, the stakes were higher than ever. Ashford had been holding its breath for so long, and now the time had come to exhale, but at what cost? The moment Kyle Avery's name surfaced, the investigation picked up pace. Detective Hayes and his team quickly reached out to contacts who could help track down the former Ashford resident. It didn't take long before they found him living in a nearby city, working under a different name. Avery had tried to move on from his past, but his connection to Lena's case had just pulled him back into the darkness of Ashford's coldest mystery. When Hayes and his team arrived at Avery's apartment to bring him in for questioning, the air was thick with tension. Avery didn't resist, but his calm demeanor only raised more suspicions. He knew they were coming. Was it guilt or just a defensive shield, a way of hiding the truth? Either way, Avery's arrest sent shockwaves through Ashford, reopening old wounds for the town, but bringing a sense of hope to those who had never stopped searching for answers. The interrogation room was quiet except for the sound of the tape recorder clicking on. Avery sat across from Hayes, his arms crossed, his eyes unfocused. The detective laid out the footage for him, showing the blurry image of him walking through the gas station parking lot, clearly following Lena. Avery's eyes flickered briefly, just enough for Hayes to notice. "You followed her that night," Hayes said firmly, leaning forward. "What? What happened to Lena?" Avery remained silent, staring at the table in front of him. The pressure in the room built with every passing second. Detective Hayes knew that silence was often the hardest part of an interrogation. But just as it seemed like the moment might stretch forever, Avery spoke. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't stop. Something inside me, something snapped." His mind raced. This wasn't a confession, not yet. But it was a crack in the dam. The truth was finally starting to seep out, and the more Avery spoke, the more the detective began to understand the twisted web that had led to Lena's disappearance. Avery confessed to following Lena that night, but he was quick to downplay his involvement. "I didn't hurt her," he insisted. "I just followed her. Watched her from a distance. I never thought it would go that far. She didn't deserve what happened next." But there was more. Avery's admission only raised more questions. He had been stalking Lena for months, perhaps longer, but why? What had driven him to become obsessed with her? And what had happened that night that caused Lena's disappearance? Was Avery alone in this, or was there someone else, someone even darker, pulling the strings behind the scenes? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit together, but the picture they were forming was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Avery's words haunted the air, and the truth seemed to be just out of reach. The detective knew that this was only the beginning, but at least now, they were no longer searching blindly in the dark. The moment Kyle Avery's confession began to unravel, the small town of Ashford was thrown into turmoil. News of his arrest spread like wildfire, and what had once been a quiet, tight-knit community was now a place full of whispers and nervous glances. The long-awaited breakthrough in Lena's case had finally arrived, but it came with a chilling realization. Avery's involvement was just one piece of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. Avery's arrest had been a shock to everyone. Many had remembered him as a quiet, reclusive figure, someone who had left Ashford years ago without much fanfare. His return was unexpected, but it wasn't the return itself that caused such an uproar. It was the fact that he was now the prime suspect in a case that had haunted the town for years. People began to question everything they thought they knew about the quiet town they'd lived in. How could someone so close, someone they'd all seen around, be capable of such a thing? For Detective Nathaniel Hayes, the arrest marked a new chapter in the investigation. But it wasn't a victory, it was a beginning. The more he learned about Avery, the more he realized that this was far from a simple case of one man acting alone. There were still too many unanswered questions. What had triggered Avery's obsession with Lena? Was there anyone else involved? And why had it taken so long for someone to connect him to the crime? As Avery was taken into custody, he was met with a flurry of media attention, but it was clear from his demeanor that he wasn't interested in the spotlight. He barely acknowledged the crowd as he was led away. His face remained a mask of indifference, though his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside him. The media coverage was relentless. News outlets scrambled to get a hold of the story, each one trying to be the first to break the details. Lena's name was once again on everyone's lips, but this time, it was no longer just about her disappearance, it was about the truth. Ashford was no longer a quiet town. It was the epicenter of a shocking revelation that would change everything. The arrest sent waves through Lena's family. Her parents, Amelia and Thomas, were initially too numb to feel anything but a hollow ache. They had hoped, prayed, and begged for answers, but now that they had won, the weight of it was unbearable. Kyle Avery, the man who had followed their daughter, was now in custody. But even as the police reported his arrest, Amelia and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Avery's quiet confession was just the beginning. They had learned to fear the unknown, and now, with their daughter's case on the verge of being solved, they couldn't help but wonder if the truth would bring them closure, or shatter everything they thought they knew. Detective Hayes, too, was left with more questions than answers. He knew this was only the beginning of a long road ahead. Avery had confessed, but his motives remained murky, and his involvement in Lena's disappearance seemed too convenient. Hayes couldn't help but wonder if someone else was pulling the strings, someone even more dangerous than Avery himself. The town of Ashford might have found one culprit, but had they truly uncovered the whole truth? The discovery of Kyle Avery's involvement in Lena Drake's disappearance shocked the small town of Ashford, but it also brought with it a haunting realization. A man who had once been a part of their community, someone who had walked their streets and lived their lives, was now the prime suspect in one of the town's darkest mysteries. But to truly understand the depth of the case, Detective Nathaniel Hayes knew that they would need to uncover more about Avery's past, about who he was before Lena disappeared. Kyle Avery was born and raised in Ashford, but his early years weren't marked by the normal patterns of a small-town upbringing. Avery had always been something of an outcast. His parents, both of whom had passed away when he was still a teenager, left him to navigate the world on his own. Despite being bright, Avery had no real connection to the town or its people. He had drifted in and out of different jobs, never truly finding a place to settle. In high school, he was the quiet kid in the back of the classroom, never quite fitting in with the others. He wasn't bullied, but he was always on the periphery of social circles. No one had paid him much attention, until the day he left Ashford for good. For years, there were no signs of Avery's return. His name barely came up in conversation, and most people assumed he had gone off to live a life somewhere far from Ashford's quiet streets. Yet, in the years that followed, whispers began to surface about his whereabouts. There were rumors that Avery had gotten involved in various criminal activities, though no one could ever confirm them. Some said he had been arrested for petty theft, while others claimed he had become involved in more serious offenses. But no one knew for sure, and no one seemed to care. Avery had faded from their lives, just as easily as he had entered them. What was known, however, was that Avery had been a loner, someone who kept to himself. His only known relationship in Ashford had been with a local girl, a brief romance that ended with him leaving town. His departure, like his return years later, had been uneventful. No one had noticed his absence at first, but by the time they did, he was already gone. When Detective Hayes first began digging into Avery's past, he found little that was useful. There were no major criminal records in Ashford or its surrounding areas, and most of Avery's activities appeared to be fairly ordinary. But as Hayes dug deeper, he found that Avery had lived in several cities across Texas, from Houston to San Antonio, before settling in a small town nearby. Over the years, he had changed his name and moved from place to place, never staying long enough for anyone to get too familiar with him. It wasn't until Hayes looked into Avery's personal history, his past relationships, his childhood, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Kyle Avery's obsession with Lena had roots that stretched back much further than anyone had imagined. He had never truly left Ashford, not mentally or emotionally. The quiet, hidden resentment he felt toward the town and its people had festered for years. And Lena, with her bright future and her connection to the community, had become a symbol of everything he had never had. In Lena, Avery saw everything he had longed for: a place in the world, a sense of belonging, and the life he had always been denied. But something in Avery snapped when he saw Lena again years after his departure. Their paths had crossed, and for reasons that were still unclear, Avery became fixated on her. It was more than just a passing attraction, it was an obsession. He watched her from the shadows, following her every move. Every time Lena smiled, Avery saw his own failures reflected in her happiness. Every time she spoke to someone, he felt a pang of jealousy and frustration. His quiet resentment grew, until it became something darker, a need to possess her, to claim a part of the life that had always eluded him. In the weeks leading up to Lena's disappearance, Avery's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He had begun to show up at the places Lena frequented, her favorite coffee shop, the library, the park. He would linger, watching from a distance, always keeping just enough distance to remain unnoticed. Lena, oblivious to the man following her, went about her life as usual, unaware that her every movement was being tracked by someone who had crossed a line. She was simply living her life as anyone would at 24, full of hope and promise for the future. But Avery's obsession grew. What started as casual observation turned into something far more dangerous. He began to plan his encounters, setting up moments when he could be near Lena without her realizing. He knew the places she would be, the time she would be there. He followed her more closely, his presence growing more pronounced as he closed in on her. The line between fascination and possession had long since been crossed, and on the night of Lena's disappearance, Avery was ready to act. But what exactly had driven him to such extremes? Was it simply his obsession with Lena, or was there more to his twisted behavior? Detective Hayes suspected that Avery had been planning his actions for weeks. The footage of him following Lena was only the beginning of what had been a carefully orchestrated series of steps leading up to her disappearance. Hayes knew that to understand Avery's true motives, they would need to dig deeper into his psyche, into the dark corners of his mind where obsession had taken root. Avery's confession had shed light on his actions, but it didn't explain everything. What had truly motivated him? Why had he chosen Lena? And what other dark secrets did Kyle Avery harbor? These questions lingered in Hayes's mind, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of a much deeper investigation into the dark underbelly of Ashford and the twisted secrets its residents had long since buried. The town of Ashford had not seen such a stir in years. Kyle Avery's arrest had shocked everyone, but it was nothing compared to the anticipation and chaos that surrounded the trial. For nearly a decade, the town had been haunted by the mystery of Lena Drake's disappearance, and now the man suspected of taking her life was finally facing justice. The trial was more than just a legal process. It was the culmination of years of pain, frustration, and unanswered questions. For the residents of Ashford, it felt as though the scales of justice were finally tipping in their favor. But the path to closure would not be easy. The courtroom, a modest room in the Ashford courthouse, was filled to capacity every day. People lined up hours in advance just to secure a seat, eager to witness the resolution of a case that had affected them all. The once peaceful town had become a place of public spectacle, with news outlets from across the state descending on Ashford to cover the trial. The eyes of the entire town, and the entire state, were now on this small courthouse. For those who had lived through the years of silence, this was a moment they had long awaited. But for Lena's family, the trial was a bittersweet event. They had fought so hard for this day to come, but now that it had arrived, the reality of what they were about to face set in. This wasn't just a trial about a crime, it was about their daughter, about the life that was stolen from them, and about the man who had done it. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Green, wasted no time in laying out its case. They focused on Avery's actions in the days leading up to Lena's disappearance and the evidence that tied him to the crime. The surveillance footage from the gas station was pivotal. Avery had been seen clearly following Lena on the night she vanished, and that was just the beginning of the damning evidence. The prosecution presented forensic evidence linking Avery to the scene, as well as testimony from experts who explained how the timeline of events aligned with Avery's movements. The prosecution's case was compelling, methodical, and built on solid evidence. But the defense, led by the seasoned and sharp-tongued attorney William Hayes, no relation to Detective Nathaniel Hayes, mounted a vigorous challenge. He argued that while the evidence seemed to point toward Avery, it was not enough to convict him of murder. He painted Avery as a man who had become obsessed with Lena, but claimed that obsession did not equate to guilt. The defense focused on Avery's mental state, suggesting that he was mentally unstable and had acted out of a distorted sense of attachment. The defense team also pointed out the lack of concrete evidence proving that Avery had actually harmed Lena. There were no witnesses to the crime, no DNA evidence, and no definitive proof that Lena had been killed by Avery. As the trial progressed, emotions ran high. Lena's parents, Amelia and Thomas, sat in the front row every day, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. They had been through so much, and yet, even in the courtroom, they were unsure of what the outcome would be. Would they finally get the justice they had been waiting for, or would they be forced to live with the knowledge that their daughter's killer might walk free? Their quiet desperation was palpable, their eyes locked on every word that was spoken in the courtroom, as if waiting for some glimmer of hope to emerge from the legal battle. The defense's strategy was clear. They wanted to plant doubt in the jury's minds. They highlighted Avery's troubled past, his history of isolation, and his apparent obsession with Lena. They painted him as a man who had spiraled into madness, but had never intended for things to go as far as they did. Yes, he followed her, Avery's defense lawyer argued. Yes, he stalked her. But that doesn't mean he killed her. He was obsessed, yes. But obsession isn't murder. The defense's argument was a delicate balancing act. They knew that if they could convince the jury that Avery's actions, while disturbing, were driven by mental illness rather than malicious intent, they might be able to secure a lesser conviction, or even an acquittal. For Detective Hayes, the trial was a whirlwind of emotions. The evidence he had worked so hard to gather was now on display for all to see, but the process of seeing it all unfold in the courtroom was something entirely different. Hayes knew that the prosecution had a strong case, but the defense's tactics left him with an uneasy feeling. He had seen cases like this before, where the defense would use every tactic to cast doubt on the evidence. He had seen juries hesitate, unsure whether the truth was clear enough to deliver a conviction. In this case, the truth seemed evident, but the uncertainty that hung over the trial threatened to cloud the clarity of the case. As the days dragged on, the tension in the courtroom grew. The jury listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally exchanging glances. The deliberations were long, with both sides presenting their final arguments. The prosecution emphasized the strength of the evidence, urging the jury to see Avery's actions for what they truly were: the deliberate, calculated steps of a man who had followed Lena for weeks, and whose obsession with her had ultimately led to her death. The defense, meanwhile, continued to argue that Avery had not meant to kill Lena and that the prosecution had failed to prove that the murder was intentional. Finally, after weeks of intense legal battles, the case was handed over to the jury. The tension in the air was palpable, and as the jury filed out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment hung over everyone in the room. For the Drake family, the verdict could mean the end of their nightmare, or it could mean that their daughter's death would never be fully understood. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Ashford streets were eerily quiet as the town awaited the jury's decision. Residents who had once gone about their daily lives now found themselves consumed by the trial. Conversations in coffee shops and on street corners centered around one question: would Kyle Avery be convicted? The weight of anticipation hung heavily over Ashford as the jury deliberated, and the tension in the courthouse grew unbearable. Every day that passed felt like an eternity, especially for the people who had been living with this mystery for so long. The jury, sequestered in a small room, pored over the details, their every decision scrutinized by the eyes of a town that had been waiting for this moment for nearly a decade. It was a moment that could either bring a sense of closure, or leave the lingering ache of unanswered questions. For the Drake family, this was their last chance at justice for their daughter, and they couldn't afford to hope for anything less than a guilty verdict. The deliberations were long and grueling. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, and each argument from both the prosecution and the defense were weighed carefully. The case was complicated, and the defense had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. Had Kyle Avery really intended to kill Lena? Could they prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had murdered her, or was his obsession a product of his troubled mental state? These were the questions that the jury had to answer. Amelia and Thomas Drake, who had been present throughout the trial, sat in the courtroom every day. Their faces were etched with a mixture of exhaustion and hope, but they knew that the coming days would be the hardest yet. Every time the door to the jury room opened, their hearts would skip a beat, but no verdict came. With each passing hour, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. The world outside the courthouse seemed to fade away as the jury worked tirelessly to make their decision. The town's atmosphere mirrored the intensity of the trial. No one was immune to the gravity of the situation. Conversations at the local diner and in the streets revolved around one topic: the outcome of the trial. Lena's case had become more than just a local tragedy, it was a symbol of justice delayed. The entire town had been affected by it. Ashford, once a place of security and familiarity, had been transformed by this long-buried secret. The sense of normalcy had been shattered by a crime that seemed too close to home. People who had never paid much attention to the crime scene now found themselves deeply involved in the quest for answers. The echoes of Lena's disappearance reverberated through the streets, and now, in the courtroom, the truth was on the verge of being revealed. The jury's discussions were not easy. They were torn not just by the evidence but by the emotional weight of the case. Many of the jurors were parents, and the thought of someone taking the life of a young woman, someone with so much promise, weighed heavily on them. As they debated, there was a deep, underlying tension. Some jurors believed that Avery's actions, though troubling, could be explained by his mental instability. Others were more convinced by the prosecution's argument that Avery had, at the very least, been responsible for Lena's death, even if the murder wasn't premeditated. It was a question of intent, a question that could determine the severity of Avery's sentence. Throughout the deliberations, emotions ran high. Some jurors were quick to argue that Avery's obsession with Lena had led him to murder, even if the actual killing had been an act of impulse, a moment of rage. The prosecution's narrative painted Avery as a man who had been unable to control his emotions, consumed by jealousy and anger at the life Lena had, which he had never been able to achieve. The defense, on the other hand, countered by emphasizing Avery's troubled mental state, suggesting that his obsession was more a result of his psychological issues than a deliberate plan to kill. For them, the question was not whether Avery had followed Lena, there was no doubt about that, but whether he had intended to take her life. Amelia Drake, sitting in the courtroom, could barely breathe as she waited for the jury to return. She had sat through the entire trial, her mind racing with the testimonies, the photographs, the evidence that had been presented. Her heart was heavy with grief, yet filled with a flicker of hope that this could finally be the moment when she would get the truth. She didn't know if she was ready for the verdict, but she knew she had no choice. Her daughter's life had been taken, and now the jury had to decide whether the person who had taken it would be held accountable. Her husband, Thomas, sat next to her, his eyes focused on the floor. The years of waiting, of wondering, of praying for answers had taken their toll. But he was resolute. He had always been a man of action, someone who faced challenges head-on, but the silence of the last decade had eroded him. His mind kept circling back to one thought: what if this isn't the right verdict? What if there's more we don't know? The room fell silent when the doors to the jury room opened. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as the jury entered the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation as they filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreman, a middle-aged woman named Linda Hayes, stepped forward to deliver the verdict. Her eyes met the eyes of the courtroom, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room held its breath. The tension was unbearable. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle Avery, guilty of the murder of Lena Drake," the foreman said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. The words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. There was a moment of stunned silence before the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief, disbelief, and shock. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. Avery, sitting in the defendant's chair, remained unmoving, his face impassive. For Amelia and Thomas, the words brought both a sense of finality and a deep, aching sorrow. Their daughter was gone, and the man who had taken her life was now being held accountable. But the victory felt hollow. It didn't bring Lena back. It didn't undo the years of pain, of searching, of hoping. It was justice, yes, but it was justice for a crime that could never be undone. The jury's decision was final. The case, after nearly a decade of heartache, had reached its conclusion. But for Ashford and for the Drake family, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. The town would never be the same, and neither would the people who had lived through the mystery of Lena's disappearance. As they left the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressed down on them. Justice had been served, but at what cost? As the verdict was handed down, a sense of finality settled over the courtroom. The jury had spoken, and Kyle Avery, the man responsible for the disappearance and death of Lena Drake, was officially declared guilty. But as the months passed and the legal proceedings wound down, it became increasingly clear that for Ashford, the trial's conclusion was just the beginning of a much more complicated journey. While the town had waited so long for this moment, the aftermath of the trial wasn't the relief they had expected. It was a long, painful process of healing that would take years. For Lena's parents, the conviction didn't immediately bring peace. Yes, Kyle Avery had been found guilty of their daughter's murder, but the pain of losing her was still fresh, still raw. The joy of the verdict was muted by the stark reality that Lena would never come back. Amelia and Thomas Drake, once hopeful and optimistic, now found themselves consumed by a quiet grief that no verdict could erase. It was the grief of knowing that their daughter, the young woman who had so much potential, had been taken too soon, and nothing could change that. They had fought so hard for this day, for this moment of justice, but now that it had arrived, they were left grappling with the complexities of what it meant. How did one live with the loss of a child? How did one continue on after so many years of unanswered questions and unbearable uncertainty? The trial had given them the answers they needed, but it hadn't given them the closure they had hoped for. It hadn't healed the gaping wound in their hearts. As the legal proceedings wrapped up, Amelia became more and more withdrawn, retreating into herself. She spent hours poring over old photographs of Lena, trying to remember her daughter as she had been, before the disappearance, before the trial. But the memories were bittersweet. Every smile, every laugh, every moment felt like it belonged to someone else, someone lost to time. She couldn't help but feel as though the girl in the pictures was a stranger now. Her daughter was gone, and no amount of justice could bring her back. Thomas, too, found himself lost in a sea of conflicting emotions. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to move forward. He had always been the strong one, the one who held his family together, but the weight of Lena's death had left him shaken to his core. He tried to keep busy, working long hours, staying active in the community, but nothing seemed to fill the void that Lena's absence had left behind. The town of Ashford had moved on, or at least appeared to. People went about their daily lives, the rhythm of life returning to normal. But for Thomas and Amelia, normal had become a foreign concept. The emotional toll of the trial wasn't confined to just the Drake family. Ashford itself was forever changed by the events that had unfolded over the past decade. The once tight-knit town had been shaken to its foundation, and the quiet streets now seemed haunted by the memory of Lena's disappearance. People who had once known each other only through casual greetings now found themselves grappling with deeper questions. How had they missed the signs? How had a man like Kyle Avery been living among them, unnoticed for so long? The answers were elusive, and the uncertainty lingered in the air. Some residents, particularly the older members of the community, found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about their home. Ashford had always been a town defined by its peacefulness, its sense of safety. But after Lena's disappearance, and the subsequent revelations about Kyle Avery, it felt like that safety had been shattered. Neighbors began to lock their doors at night, and children no longer played outside after dark. The sense of trust that had once defined the town now seemed fragile, easily broken. Ashford had become a town marked by fear, and the effects of that fear rippled through the community in subtle ways. The media, too, had played a significant role in the aftermath of the trial. Once the story broke, news outlets across Texas and the nation descended on Ashford, eager to cover the trial and the dramatic twists in the case. The town, once largely ignored by the media, was now thrust into the spotlight. The attention was overwhelming for many residents, who were unaccustomed to being part of a story that garnered such intense interest. For some, the influx of reporters and cameras was a necessary evil, a part of the process that helped bring attention to the case. For others, it was an intrusion, a painful reminder that their town was no longer the same. The Drakes, however, tried to remain out of the public eye as much as possible. They spoke to the media on occasion, but only when necessary. Amelia was especially reluctant to be in the spotlight. She had spent years battling to keep Lena's memory alive, but now that the case was over, she found herself wanting only to retreat into the privacy of her own grief. The town had its answers, but for Amelia and Thomas, the questions remained. They had always believed that justice would bring them closure, but now they knew that true closure was a myth. The ache of losing their daughter was something that could never be fully healed. As the months passed, the town of Ashford began to return to normal, but the scars remained. There were no more daily reminders of Lena's case, no more flyers, no more search parties, but her presence was still felt in every corner of the town. The local park, where she had spent so much time, now seemed haunted by the memory of her laughter. The coffee shop where she had worked was no longer just a place to grab a drink. It was a place where people went to remember her, to wonder what might have been. Even the streets of Ashford seemed to carry the weight of her absence. In the years that followed, Detective Nathaniel Hayes remained committed to finding the truth, to ensuring that Lena's memory was never forgotten. Though the case had been closed, Hayes never stopped looking for answers. He knew that there was still more to uncover about Kyle Avery, and perhaps even more unsettling, about the dark secrets that had been buried in the town of Ashford for so long. But the more he investigated, the more he realized that sometimes, the truth is never as simple as it seems. And sometimes the answers we seek are only the beginning of even deeper mysteries. The guilty verdict had rocked the town of Ashford, leaving behind a mixture of relief and unease. For many, justice had been served. Kyle Avery had been convicted of the murder of Lena Drake, and for the first time in years, the town felt like it could breathe again. But while the courtroom drama had played out, the emotional ripple effect continued to spread through the community. Ashford was a small town, and in a small town, everyone knows everyone. The verdict wasn't just a legal conclusion, it was a personal one, deeply felt by every resident, every neighbor, and every family. For some, the conviction brought a sense of justice. Finally, Lena's death had been acknowledged and her killer was held accountable. The town, which had lived in fear of a murderer in their midst for so long, now felt like a safer place. The streets, once filled with suspicion, seemed a little less ominous. There was a collective exhale as people began to let go of the fear that had lingered over them like a shadow. After all, in a town like Ashford, when something bad happens, it's not just a headline, it's a shared trauma. Everyone feels the impact. Everyone remembers the victim. But for others, especially those who had known Kyle Avery, the trial and the verdict raised a flood of conflicting emotions. Many had once considered him a friend, a quiet, unassuming presence in the community. He had never been known to cause trouble, never shown any signs of the darkness that seemed to lurk beneath the surface of his life. To hear that someone so familiar, so ordinary, could be capable of something so horrific, was almost impossible to comprehend. How had they missed it? How had they not seen the signs? The first few days after the trial were filled with awkward conversations and uncomfortable silences. Ashford had always been a town where everyone knew each other's business, but now there were unspoken questions hanging in the air. People found themselves questioning the very foundation of their relationships. If someone like Kyle Avery could be hiding such a dark secret, who else in their town might be hiding something? Was anyone really safe? Could anyone really be trusted? For the families who had supported Lena's case from the beginning, the verdict was bittersweet. Yes, justice had been served, but the reality of Lena's absence would never be erased. The sense of closure which so many had longed for felt hollow. For Amelia and Thomas Drake, the victory in the courtroom didn't fill the void left by their daughter's death. They were grateful for the conviction, but it didn't change the fact that they would never see Lena again. The trial, while necessary, had only served to deepen the wound. For them, the public reaction to the verdict was just another reminder of what they had lost, and how much they still had to heal. As the days went by, the town of Ashford began to reflect on the events that had unfolded. Some residents celebrated the conviction, relieved to see the legal process come to a close. They felt a sense of vindication. Justice had been done. The local bar even held a small celebration, offering free drinks to anyone who wanted to toast to the end of the case. For them, the trial was over and it was time to move on. But not everyone in Ashford was ready to celebrate. For those who had grown up with Kyle Avery, who had known him as a child, a friend, or a neighbor, the reaction was much more complicated. They couldn't simply put the case behind them with a toast. Many were struggling to reconcile the person they had known with the man who had been convicted of such a heinous crime. How had they not seen the signs? How had they missed the growing darkness that had consumed Avery? And, most troubling of all, how could someone they had trusted be capable of such violence? There were whispers in the town, talk of Avery's past, of things that had been known but never spoken aloud. Some claimed that Avery had always been a bit off, that there had always been something unsettling about him. Others, however, insisted that they had seen no signs of trouble. In fact, many felt they had been blindsided by the news. Avery's transformation from a quiet, almost invisible presence to a convicted murderer was something no one had expected. The town's sense of security had been shaken, and though Avery was behind bars, the fear lingered. It was the kind of fear that no one could truly name but everyone could feel. It was the fear that maybe, just maybe, there were others out there, hidden in plain sight, who were capable of similar darkness. And if Ashford, a town so familiar and close-knit, had failed to recognize the signs in one of their own, how could they ever trust themselves to see the signs again? For some residents, the trial had brought a sense of collective guilt. They felt complicit in Avery's actions because they hadn't recognized the danger sooner. The town, in their eyes, had allowed Avery to slip through the cracks, had failed to notice the signs that might have prevented Lena's tragic fate. They wondered if they could have done more, if they had spoken up earlier, if they had been more vigilant. This collective guilt weighed heavily on Ashford, and even those who had been the most vocal in their support for the prosecution couldn't escape the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong in their community. Others, however, felt a sense of relief. The trial had finally brought closure, and with it, the belief that justice had been done. They could now move on, secure in the knowledge that the man responsible for Lena's death was no longer a threat. The sense of unease that had gripped the town for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a return to normalcy, or at least an attempt to reclaim it. Life, as it often does, began to move forward. But for the Drake family, the journey was far from over. Amelia and Thomas knew that justice had been served, but it didn't bring their daughter back. It didn't bring the life they had once dreamed of for her. Justice, in this case, was a necessary but ultimately insufficient salve for their grief. They had hoped that the trial would bring them peace, but the reality was that it only added to the weight of their loss. They had their answer, but it didn't change anything. Lena was still gone. In the weeks that followed, Ashford began to move on, slowly but surely. The trial was over and life resumed. But the scars of the case, of the long years of uncertainty, of the fear that had crept into every corner of the town, remained. Ashford would never be the same. The shadows of the past had left their mark, and no amount of legal victories or public celebrations could erase the truth. A young woman had been taken and a town had lost its innocence. As the years passed, the conviction of Kyle Avery for the murder of Lena Drake became a part of Ashford's history, but it was a history that left scars that would never fade. For the people of Ashford, The case had been an experience that reshaped their sense of safety, trust, and community. While justice had been served in the courtroom, the emotional toll on the town remained. The legacy of Lena's case was not just about the legal resolution. It was about the deep, lasting impact it had on the hearts of everyone who had lived through it. For the Drake family, the years following the trial were filled with both grief and healing. They had finally gotten the answers they so desperately needed, but the closure they had hoped for never fully arrived. Amelia and Thomas tried to rebuild their lives, but the memory of Lena was never far from their thoughts. They found solace in small moments, quiet walks through the town, memories of Lena's laughter echoing in the background, but the absence of their daughter was a pain that could never be truly healed. The legacy of Lena's case was one of bittersweet justice, a reminder that even when the truth comes to light, it can never undo the damage that was done. As the years went by, Amelia became a quiet advocate for missing persons cases, using her experience to help others who were still searching for answers. She volunteered at organizations that helped families of the missing, offering support and guidance to those who were going through the same pain she had endured. But even as she helped others, there was always a part of her that could never let go of the past. She carried Lena's memory with her everywhere, a constant reminder of the daughter she had lost. Though she found some purpose in her advocacy, the grief remained, quiet and constant, like the hum of an unseen presence in the background of her life. Thomas, too, found his own way of coping. He returned to his work in the community, trying to rebuild his sense of normalcy. But the man who had once been strong and resolute was now a shadow of himself. The weight of losing Lena had altered him in ways he couldn't explain. He became more reserved, more introspective. He had always been the one to hold things together, but now he found himself lost in a sea of unspoken emotions. The town had moved on, and so had everyone around him, but Thomas felt as though he was stuck, frozen in time, unable to truly move forward. Lena's case may have been resolved legally, but emotionally, it was a wound that would never fully heal. For Ashford, the legacy of the case was a constant undercurrent in the town's identity. Once a place defined by its quiet charm, Ashford had become a town defined by its tragic past. The streets that had once seemed so familiar now felt different. They were the same streets, but they were forever marked by the events of 2002, the year Lena had vanished, and the year Ashford had learned that even the most familiar places could harbor the darkest secrets. Ashford would never be the same, and its people knew it. In the aftermath of the trial, there was a collective attempt to return to normal. The town held its annual festivals and the school sports teams continued to play. But there was always a subtle shift in the air, an awareness that lingered. Neighbors who once trusted each other without question now locked their doors a little tighter at night. Children who had once played in the streets now did so with an undercurrent of caution, always aware of their surroundings. Ashford had been touched by something it could never forget, and the scars, though invisible, were woven into the fabric of the community. The memory of Lena's case remained a part of the town's legacy, a story that would be passed down through generations. New families moved into Ashford, unaware of the full history that the town carried with it. But the people who had lived through the case never forgot. They spoke in hushed tones about the events of 2002, about the fear that had gripped the town, and about the justice that had finally come years too late. The case became a part of Ashford's folklore, a story of mystery, tragedy, and ultimate resolution. But for those who had lived through it, it was more than just a story, it was a piece of their own lives, forever tied to the town's history. For the media, the trial had been a momentary sensation, a brief but dramatic headline in the national news. But for Ashford it was something far deeper. The media had moved on to other stories, other cases, but Ashford remained forever marked by the events that had unfolded there. The cameras had packed up and left, the reporters had gone home, but the people of Ashford were left to carry the emotional weight of the case. The trial had brought them justice, but it had also brought them a reminder that sometimes the answers we seek are never as satisfying as we hope. The legacy of Lena's case was not one of complete healing, but rather one of painful acceptance. The truth had come out, but the loss still remained. In the years that followed, Detective Nathaniel Hayes remained with Ashford's police force, though the case of Lena Drake haunted him. Despite the conviction, Hayes could never fully let go of the unanswered questions. What had truly driven Kyle Avery to commit such a crime? What had been the catalyst for his obsession with Lena? As the years passed, Hayes continued to revisit the case, but he never found the peace he had hoped for. He would often return to the cold case files, re-examining the evidence, trying to find something he had missed. But each time he found himself in the same place, wondering whether the answers he sought would ever come to light. For Hayes, the case would never be truly over. As for Ashford, the town slowly moved forward, but it was forever changed. The community that had once been defined by its sense of safety and security now carried with it the weight of its past. The people of Ashford had learned that even the most ordinary of places could hold extraordinary secrets, and that justice, no matter how hard won, could never erase the scars left by tragedy. The case of Lena Drake would never be forgotten, not by the people of Ashford and not by the town itself. It was a part of them now, woven into the very fabric of their history. And though time would move on, the legacy of Lena's case would remain, a quiet reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of even the most peaceful places.